continue to communicate with each other, and just this past week we were back there, and of course he and his wife, Sister Ruth, were not, but they made me feel just at home. And Matthew, his son, Matthew, would you stand up, please, so we can see you? We're happy to have you this morning. And but I am just excited to begin this conversation with a dear friend and brother, one who has traveled and continues to travel all over the world, teaching and preaching the gospel. Has worked. He works with the founder and people who operate Trinity Broadcast Network. You have seen him. Some of you have seen him on that network. I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and to tell us he is working on a project in terms of his own academic pursuits. He wanted to come here and do that, but we did not have the setup for him to do it. But he is also working around the globe, with especially in countries on the continent of Africa and in South America, that we need to be more in line with in terms of doing ministry, and friends that we need to have for doing ministry. Brother Chironna, would you now talk to us in your own way?
Dr. Earl, it's an honor to be here with you and with all the distinguished faculty and friends at ITC. Certainly I am deeply appreciative of who you are, what you carry. You have had a major impact on my life. When we both presented at Archbishop Brantley's, and I heard you share on the sufferings of Job, having had gone through for me a 3.5-year, very painful, dark journey. I had never, in all my years of preaching or hearing preachers, and I've been around some pretty significant preachers, I've never heard anyone articulate in the course of an hour the wisdom of the sufferings of Job the way I heard you. And it immediately endeared me to you because of the way God has framed your perception of who he is, what he's about. And my journey is an interesting one in that my educational journey, I was a Bachelor of Arts graduate of music and education, but at that time I was converted, and so I double majored in religion, studied Greek in my undergraduate courses, and then comparative religion and all the things that were part of religious studies at Wagner College. Ended up going to a non-denominational Bible school for 3 years. After that, I got a Master's of Divinity from a Baptist school that didn't know what to do with a covenant theologian that wasn't a dispensational. And so that was interesting. They had to give me the degree because I did the homework, and even though my my view of Scripture was different than theirs. So listen, I've learned to agree with everybody, you know, just and then I got a PhD in leadership based on the work of, because of the nature of prophetic ministry, I pursued a degree in leadership from a prophetic perspective. That was years ago. And then in 2000, having spent all these years in ministry, pastoral ministry, I began to feel as though there was something missing in terms of what I would call soul work. That bringing people to wholeness required more than our dogmatic approach to theology or our systematic approach to theology, that there needed to be an integration between the spiritual, theological, and the soulical and psychological. And so I was accepted at Saybrook University, which of all places is the seat of the secular humanist potential movement, where Rollo May was the founder and Abraham Maslow was the co-founder along with Carl Rogers. Ironically, sitting at Saybrook, I discovered that Rollo May was a Presbyterian pastor that came to a place in his journey where he was wrestling with the same things I was. And at the encouragement of Paul Tillich, he was provoked by Paul to become the father of existential psychology in America. And then to find out that Abraham Maslow was raised a Russian Orthodox Jew. They escaped the oppression of Russia at the turn of the century, moved to Brooklyn. And so when I began to study Maslow and found out that much of his understanding of the actualization of human potential came out of his Torah teachings growing up, that was quite something, because there was given to me, within the context of a totally secular discipline, a fresh appreciation for the dignity of man and for the pursuit that we all have for wholeness and well-being. My doctoral chair, who passed away, was the world's leading expert on William James. And so I did my master's on the person of Jesus in terms of his humanness and how he related to the divine. And I was pursuing the doctorate, and then I hit that long, dark tunnel. And in that long, dark tunnel, I could hardly function. I spent 3.5 years in extreme anxiety and depression, was on all sorts of meds and could hardly function, and really thought my life was over. So by the grace of God, he brought me through that. And I was just coming out of that when I met you. And it was at that time I wanted to complete the PhD, but wasn't sure that, and my doctoral chair had passed away, so the thought of, I wanted to sit at his feet because he was the world's leading expert on James. But in the process, God began to redirect me to look at semiotics. And there was a man that wrote about dark signs and obscure symbols that provoked me to look at semiotics. The only problem was, because I had a psychology degree as a master's, I could not parlay that into a doctoral degree in theology with ITC. But because I'm a good friend of Leonard Sweet, Len was able to work out a way in which George Fox University took all my credits in psychology towards the semiotics, the doctorate in semiotics and future leadership studies, which I'm in the midst of right now. And I've got about another 1.5 years and I'll be done. But with that semiotics degree, I will be able to combine the psychology and the theology, the spirituality and the psychology in a way that I think can integrate based on where we are. I think when we talk about globally, I think there's a crisis in leadership, and I think that the signs of our times need to be re-signed because the narrative demands it. And so from my perspective, the big question for me right now is, what's Jesus up to and where's he going? And if he is the sign that we are to follow, and we are the signs that follow him, then what are the signs that we need to be looking at in the culture, globally and locally, that are indices of the Spirit's moving? And I think God's moving in places that the church hasn't gone yet. And that's the problem the church has, is that we want God to stay contained within the institutionalized form of what we call Christendom. And it seems as though God's doing an end run around the church and going places that we have not been willing to go.
Well, that's, thank you. Let's see if we can push the conversation a little further in a focalized direction. You focused us, but there are some concerns that we have in terms of what we are doing here
Sure.
at ITC. Say some more, if you will, about how we have done this as a church, made this compromise in terms of failing to understand the Spirit of God and where God is moving us. Do you see that do you think that that's been a problem with seminaries as well?
No, I think seminaries are doing the best they can with what they have based on what has been handed to us. I think we need dogmatic theology. I think we need systematic theology. I think we need to understand how to exegete the text. I think where we are, though, in a postmodern culture where the prevailing paradigm is there are no absolute truths, so we question everything. In that kind of a context, whoever tells the best story wins. So what we need to do is become refamiliarized with the narrative we've been entrusted with and understand how that narrative plays itself out in a context of a culture that doesn't believe in absolutes. Now, the irony is when a secular postmodern says there are no absolutes, they are making a definitive absolute statement. And so what they're really saying is the only absolutes are the ones that I believe in. And so they have their narrative. So I think we are living in a day when we need to recover the beauty of the narrative and find out how it fits into the context of where we are and where we're going.
Say some more about that in terms of the seminary, because seminaries are, standalone seminaries, as you know, are having many of them are having a real struggle for their own lives, existence now. Say some more about that.
For sure, and because the culture is now challenging every presupposition that, at least for those in Christendom, we have held and as tradition, seminaries are going to have to do something to reinvent themselves in terms of the way we present the truth, present the narrative, and invite conversation. And so one of the things for me that I would say, based on my journey thus far, is that there needs to be some sort of a national conversation on what we can do in academia to make sure our voice is not eliminated from the conversation. Brueggemann, when Brueggemann deals with the fact that the pit is virtually the place where Joseph and Jeremiah find themselves when the powers that be want to remove their word from the sentence, then at some point we need to either see ourselves as Joseph's and Jeremiah's and find out in the narrative how we get out of the pit and actually become the voices that people listen to precisely because of being marginalized.
Wow. Yeah, you mentioned Brueggemann. In terms of the African-American community, what do you know, because we've already, marginalization has been kind of a place of normalcy for us. How do you see us, these communities, from where you sit, making a contribution to that narrative in a new way? Let me give you an example. If you take TBN, I noticed that most of the audience, or so many of the audiences now are heavily, that are on that station are heavily populated with African Americans.
Absolutely.
Say a word about that.
Well, here's what I think. You're talking about a white guy from New York that doesn't know what culture he really fits in for a number of reasons. I marched with the Young Democrats at 14 years old. My dad was a staunch Republican. The state senator was his dear friend, and I was marching on behalf of all sorts of things going on in the civil rights movement, and the senator called my father because he happened to be at the demonstration and said, "What's your son doing there?" And when I got home, I said, "Dad, you taught me that everybody is equal." And I said, "I don't hear that coming from your friend the senator." And I think that there needs to be a way in which, when Dr. King said, "Let justice roll down like waters," at 14 years old, I wrestled with those issues. At 15 years old, I was raised Presbyterian. Okay, so I was raised with pretty decent theology. The thing about Presbyterianism for me, though, was that I didn't know what I believed there either, because on the one hand, we were given the shorter catechism, Westminster Catechism, and on the other hand, William Barclay was their hero. So I didn't know if I was a Universalist or if I was a Calvinist. I didn't know which one I fit in. And sorting that out at 15 years old was really difficult for me. And so, but what changed my life was the autobiography of Malcolm X. I had to read it in humanities class. And when you get to the end of Malcolm's journey, when he goes to Mecca and discovers that he is not marginalized because of the color of his skin, and that there are all sorts of cross-cultural dynamics going on within that world, something in his heart gets tenderized. Now, I contend that if your heart is tenderized to love, and if God is love, then God had a major impact on Malcolm's life. And so he comes back into an American culture where there is a great disparity in terms of equality. And he finds himself having to redefine his message, only to be met with resistance. So for me, where it really hit home, I mean, my son Matthew is with me today. My wife and I, and if I get to talking too much, just tell me to hush. My wife and I lost our first child and could not have any other children, and God asked us if we would be willing to adopt. And we said yes, and God specifically said, would you be willing to adopt an African-American child? And I mean, these were moments. There was no audible voice. There was just an awareness. And we said yes. And within 2 days, the phone rang, and Matthew was still not born. It was days before he was going to be born. And we were able to do an out-of-state biracial adoption at a time when the laws were changing. And we were able to secure that adoption. I mean, the whole thing was a sovereign miracle. But in the process, we were in Raleigh, North Carolina. We had just started pioneering a church there in 1988. And at the time, in terms of statistics, Raleigh was the most covertly racist city in the South in terms of its policies. And here we were endeavoring to build a cross-cultural church in that city. And it wasn't until Matthew came along that we found out just how covertly racist the city was. So, and I could go into all the details, but that and I have always been involved in cross-cultural ministry. Most of my ministry has been in the urban church, sure. So that's all I know. But the thing that I've learned in terms of urban ministry is that because of the marginalization of the African American community, there is a sense of community in the African American church that is sorely lacking in the greater culture of Christendom. And so I never felt so at home as I did when I found myself in the context of the African American church, because it was family. And in family, even if you have differences, you still love each other. You still work through your differences. You are tolerant, so that if I'm going to be dogmatic about an issue, I am not going to do it at the expense of destroying a person for whom Christ died. Amen. I learned that in the African American church.
So you would say that that's why we don't, African Americans don't put, well, let me put it this way. We are slow to put dogma above the person.
Absolutely.
I mean, and I think what really brings us together is aesthetics, the singing, the joy that we derive, even when we differ ideologically or we differ theologically over an issue. We can still get together and praise God and rejoice when the music starts.
Absolutely, because goodness and beauty are part of who God is, and those are unifying factors.
Now, in terms of the church globally, our taking the message of globalizing our presence, around the world in terms of what we do here at ITC, what would you see as some of the challenges, and what would you see as some of the strengths that we have to offer?
Well, I think, number one, the rich diversity of what you have at ITC is worth talking about. And so I think coming into the 21st century, understanding that the language of the day is Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, I think my wife refused to get emails. Never wanted to work with a computer, and it took her until about 5 years ago to be willing to have an email address. And so I lived with a woman who was convinced that she didn't need emails until she was missing out on all sorts of communication. And I was late coming to the Facebook community. I was late coming to the Twitter community. But I think that seminaries in particular, if we're going to get our message out, we need to begin to look at the fact that WikiFaith is a reality for us right now. And if we're going to engage with millennials, then we need to begin to communicate at a level where they can relate to us and provide little, because their span of attention is about 8 seconds. So we live in a soundbite culture and in an image-driven culture where Vimeo now is saying if you put a video on the web, 8 seconds. So how do we say in an economy of words things that can provoke mystery, insight, and hunger as it relates to the narrative? How do we do that as seminaries? How do we do that as academicians? How do we do that as preachers of the gospel that want to take the gospel to the ends of the earth?
Oh, well, that's a, provoking question, because we don't, maybe in the seminaries, even in our own education, we don't think like that, because the narrative for us is so complex. And we often see that as overly simplifying. Mm-hmm. The message, the truth.
Right.
How do you deal with it?
Well, I think the message on the one hand, I think orthodoxy is paradoxy. I think it is both profound and simple at the same time. So if God can come down and make mud cakes and build us from a mud pie, then I've got to learn how to dumb down these heavenly realities and get my hands dirty with the culture and be willing to identify with where people are.
Mud cakes, mud pies, huh? I hear you.
I mean, he takes the dust, he spits on it, and he builds us. I mean, God condescends, comes down to the very least valuable substance in creation, and it's dust. And he builds us from dust. He gets his hands dirty. He dumbs down and then breathes life into what he dumbed down and says, this is my masterpiece.
You travel all over the world, and help us with certain countries in Africa that you've been to and spoken, and in light of our conversation here.
Ironically, Africa has been called the dark continent.
Right.
The reality is, if I were to take you right now to Ghana or to Zimbabwe or to Zambia or to Botswana or to Joburg, South Africa, my thing is it's the light continent, because the men and women that I am meeting from the African continent who are preachers of the gospel and professors who teach, they're some of the most brilliant minds I have ever met in my life. And the culture and the context in which they preach the gospel gives them a unique angle on how to interpret Scripture that is so contrary to the way the American church looks at the story. And I personally believe that in the next decade, we are going to begin to see an emergence of global recognition of African leaders who have something to say to the American church that we've been missing. Because historically, they have taken their lead from us. And what's happening now is that I think they are inviting us to see something. For example, to go to Ghana and to see that the churches there are prospering and that economic empowerment is something that they believe and live, and to see people that go from abject poverty to entrepreneurship and to see the success of that speaks to me of Isaiah 61. The first mandate is we preach the gospel to the poor. Jesus never starts at the center. He always starts at the periphery. He always goes to the marginalized. The gospel never starts where everything's happening. Jesus goes to the have-nots, and he begins with the gospel to the poor. But by the time you get to verse 4 or 5, where it says, they will rebuild the desolate cities and repair the breaches, it's the marginalized that bring transformation to the culture, because those that are in positions of power have no ability to see the needs that are not being met. But, so if we can recover the term revival and not make it a dirty word, I believe true revival happens at the margins, but leads to genuine reformation so that the last becomes first. And because I believe a God is a God of reversals, and there is a last that is going to become first if we dare to believe our story is that good.
Wow.
Am I doing okay?
Oh, of course. Yeah. I think you've given us food for thought. And why don't we now turn it over to hear a response from the panelist, because I know there are students in the audience and people out there who want to get in on the conversation.
Sure.
But let's do the panelist at this point and then go from there to